Welcome to the Good News Spectacular. I'm your host, Roger Thompson. The Good News Spectacular takes you up close and personal with people and events in the journey we call life, from birth to death and beyond. Sometimes the journey of life is filled with joy, happiness, prosperity, and peace. Other times the journey of life can be filled with pain, anxiety, and fear. God never promised the journey would always be smooth. Quite the contrary. God said there will be difficult times in the journey of life. But for those who choose to believe, God also promised to be with us in the journey. Tonight's show is entitled The MiniStock Miracle. In July of 1992, my brother and co-host Doug Thompson won the MiniStock National Championship at the Kansas State Fairgrounds in Hutchinson, Kansas. Doug had won the event in 1988, so winning the event was not unique. However, when Doug got out of the car in Victory Lane, he gave the glory to God. That wouldn't be particularly unusual. However, because Doug also explained the journey was the result of divine intervention. The media reported the event just as Doug explained it, and the event became known as the MiniStock Miracle. When we return from break, you're going to see Doug's daughter, Taylor, with her dad here at the Kansas Auto Racing Museum many years after he won that 1992 National Championship. Stay tuned. You don't want to miss the rest of this show. Welcome back to the Good News Spectacular. I'm your co-host Doug Thompson with co-host Roger Thompson. Roger, of course, today's show is entitled The MiniStock Miracle, and later in the program, my daughter Taylor did an interview with me when we won the Nationals, 36th running of the Nationals at Hutchinson, and that was back in 1992. Of course, Taylor wasn't even born yet when I won that race. And that's a neat little story. And of course, we're at the Kansas Auto Racing Museum where we're filming. And the story on the MiniStock, of course, is one that we know pretty well because you had gone to a sale, a foreclosure sale, as I recall, when we bought the racetrack. Yes, that's right, we did. And Racing Ray Weber from Junction, an old Plaza Speedway racer,
Right.
suggested that we ought to look into these mini-stocks. He called them mini-stocks. It hadn't even originated yet. And he said, why don't you put together a class of cheap cars for young people who want to get started, like Pintos and little Chevys and things like that, Toyotas, whatever, and try to make the class affordable. And I thought that was an excellent idea. Approached you about it, and that was in the mid-'80s, and I think it's about '85. Maybe even before that. But anyway, we started that class, and the car you won the race with in '92 is sitting right over here in the museum. I was there that day, and I had no idea when we started that class in '85 that we were going to see one of the most exciting races ever at the Nationals in that class. And of course, you won in 1988. I think it was with the same car.
No, it was a sister to that car.
Wasn't
Yeah.
the same car? All right.
Yeah.
And then in '92, that race was, the second place guy was fast, and he was on your bumper. And I watched that last 5 laps of that, and had you made a mistake, it would have been over. He was much faster.
Yeah.
He would have been long gone.
That was Derek Klima that was running that car that went
Is
on
that right?
and started Belleville Motor. Well, he didn't start Belleville Motorsports, but he owned it for a while and runs late models now, ran modified. An excellent racer, and he was very fast that day. As I looked at that film footage, there's a number of things, of course, I saw from the film footage. He was way faster. If he'd have got the lead on me and been able to clear without incident, then he'd have walked away from me. I couldn't have caught him. I wasn't the fastest car that day, probably the 4th fastest maybe.
Fortunately, in those days, the guys drove a lot differently than what I've seen these days. He did not try to root you out of the way. He didn't try to push you or try to run you into the corner faster than you could go. It was a good, clean race like we'd had in the 70s and 80s and 90s. I mean, give it to his credit. I didn't know who it was.
Yeah.
But he was a very clean, smooth driver.
Yeah, it was an excellent race, and of course you'll hear me talk about it when I do the interview with Taylor about the things that were going on at that time in my life, about going through spiritual warfare. And when we talk about Good News Spectacular, that's pretty much the premise of the show, is how the Lord has worked in our lives and other people's lives. It's not just ours. We just happen to share some of our own stories. But because of the Good News Spectacular, there's not a time I don't go somewhere and somebody will kind of hint to a story. They don't have the nerve necessarily to say, I want to go on air with you and share that story. But they want me to know, and you probably run across it too, that they want me to know that, hey, I went through some events too, and the Lord does work, and He does work in people's lives, and miracles are still continuing, and they haven't changed. And I know that that's true. We had one miracle we've never even related that the family knows about, that involved a war between Satan and God won, and that's a whole nother story for another segment. But the Good News Spectacular is just what it appears. So if you're sitting at home and you're watching this and you say, oh, you know, how's all this happened here? Roger had a near-death experience, and Doug has a miracle event with the MiniStock. We started the MiniStock class at our own racetrack. Well, the simple way to it is the Lord's working in your life. If you're in a relationship with the Lord, then the Lord's actively working in your life. When He says He wants to be Abba Father, meaning Father, then that's what He wants to be to us. And that's the kind of relationship certainly that each of us try to maintain with Him. And as I go about my daily prayer and activities, I involve Him in all of those conversations, because there's nothing too big, nothing too small for Him. We've got to take a break, but when we come back, we're going to continue on about the MiniStocks. Thanks for watching. Welcome back to the Good News Spectacular. I'm Doug Thompson with co-host Roger Thompson. Roger, we were talking a little bit about the MiniStock class, how it started, and it became a nationwide series and still is nationwide. And I remember, of course, when I was working on late model and you were racing sprint cars at the time, but you came back and come out to the shop and you said, hey, we put a deal together where we bought into that the racetrack that we knew as Plaza Speedway. It had the name of Flint Hills, wasn't it? Flint Hills Speedway,
no, not at
Flint
that
Hills
time.
Raceway.
I don't remember what they called it. Flint Hills was when someone else owned,
Yeah.
someone else leased it from us.
Yeah, you're right.
I don't remember the original
I
name
don't
now. I know
remember
that we
either.
got involved in helping get it zoned and in supporting it.
Yeah.
And
Well, I won the very first race out there when that track first opened. I should remember it because it's on the name of the track's on the trophy that I won, and I won the points championship out there the very first year. And then we sort of raced out there sporadically from there, and you did too, sporadically. But somewhere along in there, after you got us into that financial arrangement where we owned some of the track, or a good part of it, and ultimately owned it all, we went out to the track and we were standing there, and I remember, I think it was you and I that were talking, and maybe some others, but I was saying, I don't understand. There's 5 classic cars, there's like 13 cars total, there's can't be over 200 people, and all of the kids that are 17, 18, 19 are up in the stands. Why? Why is it this way? Because when we were 12, we wanted to be out on the racetrack. And so how come there's no young people out here that are getting into new classes? And that's that conversation you said that Ray Weber had shared with you about, well, there's no entry-level class.
well, Ray was a regular attendee. But you got to remember, Ray was racing in the 50s up at
Right.
the Plaza Speedway, and it was always part of his life. He lived 2 miles from the racetrack, still does. And when he started in those jalopies, they literally were $200 cars.
Yeah.
And it was part of his upbringing in his early racing career that they raced cars that cost that much, and it was an excellent idea. I didn't know quite until you and I visited how we would implement that. But during the break, I thought about all of the guys now who got started in that
Clint
MiniStock class. Yeah, Clint Boyer was in there. And a lot of these kids, they're not kids anymore, these men, they're racing late models and doing real well in the modified class and other classes, started in the MiniStock class. And it was an excellent training experience.
Oh, it
for
was.
them.
It went from a car count that was, once we took over the track and reconfigured things a bit, then the car count got up to be about 70 cars during that period of time. And the class literally took off because, if you remember right, we built a Vega first, and I put a bar on the driver's side and left the almost everything else in the original gas tank, no roll bar, no nothing.
No.
A seat belt that was with the seat, and used that one, and we made a car for you. It was a
Junk.
yeah, it was junk, just like the Vega. And then, of course, our
Toyota.
buddy,
Mine was a Toyota.
and I don't remember what Don Moore's had.
He had
but
a station wagon.
no, not initially. He came out with one just like we did, because he wasn't going to let us have something that he couldn't play in too. So the three of us went out. Remember the first week that we went out, came back with the Vega. It was painted up, put some of the drivers out there in it, and they drove it into the straightaway. Speedometer still working. It was running about 72 miles an hour if you stayed in the groove. And then so I said, next week we're going to have a race. And so we built a car for you. Don Morris built his own. And so the three of us went out. You remember the very first mini stock race?
That, yeah.
All three of us were just every corner. We weren't beating each other up. We were just passing each other and racing and racing. And we came across the line, and the three of us were right there, and we slid on into the pits, jumped out of our cars, and the crowd was just screaming and hollering what crowd there was there, and it was beginning to grow. And we said, next week we're going to be out with a new class of cars, and it's going to pay $200 to win the feature. And everybody, wow. And he said, what's it called? And I said, these are small stock cars, because it didn't have any name. I said, these are small stock cars. These are little cars. These are mini stock cars. And so that's what they became. And the announcer said, mini stocks. He said, yep, that's what they are, is mini stocks.
Mini stocks.
And so from there, they went, that took off so well, it spread to neighboring tracks, of course. And I got a call from the Roberts group out of I-70 and said, we hear you got a new class of cars that's taken off. Can you come up and introduce it to us? And I said, well, I think so. So I went up there with that little mini stock and got on that high bank asphalt track. Had no idea if those wheels would even take it, and it could almost flat-footed around that track. And I thought, well, this is either going to be spectacular, and I'm going to bounce off of the wall, or they're going to think this is pretty neat. Well, fortunately, after about 5 laps, I pulled in, and I said, see? And they said, so they started the class, and it took off. Oklahoma, track in Oklahoma did it. Pretty soon, Jay Husker Racing out of Nebraska said we want to start the class.
We sent our rules out to everybody.
Eventually,
they followed
but yeah. I sent the rules out, and I went up to race in Belleville, and that was the Jay Husker Racing event. And so I pulled on in, and they checked my car, and they said, you're not legal. And I said, what are you looking at? Yeah, and they said, the rules. And I said, I wrote these rules. This car is legal. Everything's based on this. And so once we got through it, the interpretation of the rules, my car was legal, and so we raced up there. And then that class of cars became nationwide, and it still is a mini stock class. And like you said, Clint Boyer and some others got into the class that got a good entry level. You learned the basics of the racing, and it was fun, and it was certainly affordable, because in those days everybody had access to a $50 car.
Sure, yeah, there were a lot of them around, and that was it was really fun to watch that class grow, because it was no time, and we were up to 60 or 70 of those little mini stocks.
Yeah, it was a neat class, and ultimately, of course, the Nationals picked them up, and I was fortunate enough, good Lord bless me, I won the first Nationals event in '88, which was the first time they ran, and then we won again in '92. And I hope you've enjoyed watching the show. We'll be back.
Dad, I know you drove many of the cars, which are now on display in the museum, but I happen to know that we're standing in front of one of your favorites. What's so special about this mini stock display?
Yeah, Taylor, you're right. The mini stock display is probably the most monetarily inexpensive display in the museum, but it is the most precious to me. However, Taylor, the more important story involving this mini stock happened at the 36th running of the Nationals held in Hutchinson in 1992. You might call it the day the Lord got Satan off my back. Before 1992, my team had averaged 15 to 20 feature wins a year in the Midwest. We figured 1992 would be the same. We thought we would be in the top 3 in every race, but time after time, the car refused to finish. At the time, I was driving a Pinto in the class of cars I created. My experienced crew knew how to get a car to the finish line, but week after week, I'd get in position to win, and a mechanical failure would kill us. It usually happened on the last lap and could not have been more frustrating. The guys felt jinxed. I believed it was spiritual warfare, but when I tried to explain it to the crew, they gave me blank stares. My mother tried to instill faith in me and God, but somehow I just didn't seem to get a hold of it. I chose to do whatever I wanted to do, whenever I wanted to do it. In 1989, however, I felt drawn to re-examine my life, to ask God if He would still let me walk His path. I was doing okay in the eyes of the world, but I knew I was headed for hell. Apparently more of my mother's teaching had stuck with me than I realized. When I turned to Jesus, spiritual warfare broke out. I could feel the dark side of the supernatural at work, tempting me back to my old ways. The enemy knew how to work on my pride, too. I had had significant success in racing, even to supporting my family when I was in college by driving race cars. I was confident in myself, to say the least. The highlight of our 1992 season came at the Hutchinson Nationals. For those of us in the Midwest, the Nationals were the Daytona 500 and Indianapolis 500 all rolled into one. You could see 10,000 fans and sponsors in the stands. I'd won in 1988, the first year of the mini-stock class, but now because of all of the mechanical failures, our confidence was very low. I knew Satan was behind it. I felt he wanted to see me angry, to hear me blame the Lord for the breakdowns, to hear me curse, to take the Lord's name in vain. The night before the Nationals, we raced at my home track, Plaza Speedway in Junction City, which is now Whiskey Lake Raceway. I started in the back of the feature, worked my way up to a half-track lead with only 2 laps to go, and another mechanical failure prevented us from winning. My team quietly loaded the car, but when we reached the shop, I lost it. I smashed a chair over the fender of the car. I did not curse, and I most certainly did not take the Lord's name in vain. I told my crew we were going through spiritual warfare. The guys looked at me, and I knew they just didn't get it. I told the crew to forget about the Nationals. There was no point in going. My crew said our bad luck, as they saw it, would change. Again, I told the crew it wasn't bad luck, it was spiritual warfare. I went home and went to bed.
About 6 in the morning, Doug received a call from his pit crew. The crew had worked all night on the race car. They called and said they really wanted to go racing. Nothing could go wrong. They had even put a double spring on the accelerator return and had anchored it in 2 separate places. They assured Doug problems he had in the past were over. Reluctantly, Doug agreed to go racing. Doug finished second in his heat race. That put him inside second row for the feature. The crew kept assuring him that nothing would go wrong.
I sat in the car looking at the crowd, enjoying the pageantry, enjoying the emotions I got before a race, and too I thought about the Lord. I'd never ask him to let me win because I figured other guys were asking him the same thing. But I didn't want Satan to scratch me out of another race, so I bowed my head and prayed. My Heavenly Father, I know and you know what Satan wants. He has tried, and he's given it his best shot, and he's failed. I have persevered. And although my racing has been important to me, it is not as important as my relationship with you. If it is your will that I run this race without interference from Satan, then let it be. Amen. We took the green flag and I followed the pole setter into corners 1 and 2. Coming off of the corner, the pole setter pushed to the top of the track and I took the lead on the backstretch. I led the first 2 laps, but coming off of the second corner on the backstretch, I felt the accelerator pedal go to the floor. I knew the double spring setup had failed. The accelerator had stuck wide open. I knew Satan was at work. Earlier in my career, it had stuck open on a different car and thrown me into the wall, destroying my car. I knew we were in trouble. I knew what to do. I quickly looked to the backstretch area in case I had to spin the car off the straightaway, or at the least, move out of traffic, hit the kill switch, and end my run at the Nationals Championship. As I was about to throw the switch, the pedal returned to my foot in corner 3. I kept going. Then it collapsed again as soon as I exited corner 4 and mysteriously returned to me in corners 1 and 2. Suddenly I realized something. It had to be the Lord. It had to be divine intervention. Nothing else could explain it. The accelerator stuck down again coming off corner 2. The car came loose and shot down the backstretch. I said, Lord, normally I feather the car a little more through that area than you did. I chuckled to myself as I imagined the Lord responding to me, my reflexes are a bit quicker than yours, and I don't need to feather it through that area. The race roared on, with me having the use of the accelerator through the corners and the pedal sticking to the floor wide open on the straightaways. I saw the white flag signaling the last lap. Then I saw the checkered flag. We'd won the 1992 Nationals without the benefit of an accelerator. I headed for victory lane. The accelerator collapsed to the floor again and would not return. I had to throw the kill switch. We had to push it onto the scales in victory lane. I told the story to my crew and the press covering the event. My crew lifted the hood to verify the return springs were gone and the accelerator was stuck to the floor. I had no tow strap to pull the accelerator up, and our solid motor mounts were still intact, which kept the engine from rocking, eliminating any possible explanation other than mine. So ended the spiritual warfare. After that I'd won, and I lost, but it always had to do with the car and my own ability. On that July day in the middle of Kansas, the Lord answered my simple prayer and brought an end to that type of spiritual warfare against me.
The Kansas Auto Racing Complex is not only home to the Kansas Auto Racing Museum, but also to Kansas racing products. Thank you for watching. If you're in the central Kansas area, be sure to visit the museum.
Welcome back to the Good News Spectacular. I'm Doug Thompson with co-host Roger Thompson. And Roger, you were right. That was an awfully good race. And even though that's been many years ago since I ran that race, every time I watch that film footage of the race, I get the chills. Not because of the racing. Been in lots and lots of racing and won lots of races and lost lots of races. So that part is nice to watch, especially when you win. But as I look back at that footage, it's just a wow to me to know how the Lord worked in that situation. Hope you've enjoyed the show. Thanks for watching.